Today I'm going to be talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, what it is, some of the characteristics of PTSD, and why it can look so differently in different people. Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about post-traumatic stress disorder and some of the features and characteristics of PTSD to help you get a better understanding of what this condition is all about. But before I get into that, just a couple of disclaimers to go over. I'm a registered psychologist in the province of British Columbia, Canada, and this video is for informational purposes only. It is not intended as a replacement or substitute for advice from your doctor or mental health professional. Now, with those two things out of the way, let's start talking about PTSD. Now, PTSD is a very well-known condition, but one of the things that I find with PTSD is that people have heard a lot about it, but often don't really fully understand some of the characteristics of PTSD and what are the various symptoms that can be associated with PTSD. In my experience, what I've noticed is that a lot of people seem to relate PTSD to any form of emotional distress or upset following a traumatic incident. And the reality is it's much more than that. And there's a lot of complexity to PTSD and a lot of various symptoms that can comprise PTSD. So that's what this video is really designed to do, is to help give a better understanding of what PTSD looks like and how it can present itself in different people. Now, the first thing to understand about PTSD is that it comprises of 4 different clusters of symptoms. And I'm going to go over each of these in some detail. So the first cluster of symptoms is something we call re-experiencing symptoms. Now, these re-experiencing symptoms are what people typically think about when they think about PTSD. So these are your prototypical PTSD symptoms that you see portrayed in movies and television shows. So things like intrusive, unwanted memories of the traumatic event. So I'm going about my day and I have these intrusive thoughts or memories or images of the event coming to my mind even though I don't want to think about them. This can also include nightmares, so unpleasant dreams, nightmares about the incident itself, but it can also be nightmares about themes related to the incident. So it isn't necessarily just a replaying of the trauma, but it could be thematically related to the trauma. People can experience flashbacks. Now, the thing about flashbacks is they're different than having vivid memories or thoughts or images of the incident. Flashbacks are almost like a distorted sensory state where it feels like a person is almost back in the traumatic situation, back in the event. So at extreme states, this can take the form of dissociation, where the person is no longer in the room with you or in the room and aware of what's going on around them, and they feel like they're right back in the moment. Other times this can take sort of less extreme examples of that. So it could be that a person experiences or actually smells or feels like they're smelling smells that they had at the time or that they smelled at the time of the trauma itself. So, for example, someone who is involved in a motor vehicle accident can sometimes, when they're thinking about or they have this re-experiencing flashback, they can actually smell the smell of gasoline, even though there's no gasoline in the room with them. These re-experiencing symptoms can also take the form of psychological distress or emotional reactivity. So things like intense anger or high levels of anxiety or panic or panic attacks, where a person actually experiences physiological symptoms like accelerated heart rate, shortness of breath, muscle tension, trembling, shaking, those types of things in response to triggers or reminders of the traumatic event. So if a person's in a situation where something reminds them of the event, they get really anxious and distressed and could potentially have a panic attack. So those are all examples of re-experiencing symptoms. They're ways in which a person re-experiences or relives the traumatic event. The second cluster of symptoms in PTSD is something we call avoidance symptoms. Now, avoidance symptoms can take two primary forms. The first is avoidance of thoughts or memories or feelings associated with the traumatic event. So this can be things like intentionally trying not to think about the traumatic event. Whenever thoughts or memories come up, you try and push those thoughts or memories out of your head. It can also take the form of using alcohol or drugs to try and suppress these memories or these feelings as a way of almost self-medicating or using the drugs or alcohol to help suppress the memories and thoughts. Avoidance can also take the form of behavioral avoidance. So avoidance of situations, places, or people that remind you of the traumatic event. So some examples of this are if I was in a motor vehicle accident, I may avoid driving by the scene of the motor vehicle accident. If I was involved in an assault where a friend of mine was present at the time of the assault and they were assaulted as well, maybe just being in the presence of that friend or seeing that friend after the assault could bring up memories or thoughts of the assault that are distressing to me, and so maybe I avoid seeing that friend or avoid talking to that friend. So these avoidance symptoms can really lead to a lot of interference in a person's life and cause a lot of problems for them as their world tends to get smaller and smaller and smaller as a result of these avoidance symptoms. The third cluster of symptoms relates to a changing in the way a person experiences emotion and a changing in the way they think about the traumatic event or think about themselves and the world more generally. So this can take the form of failure to remember really important parts of the traumatic experience. So this is usually as a result of what we call dissociation, where a person experiences an extreme state of stress and anxiety during the traumatic event, and it's almost like they detach from the experience while it's happening to them. So a person who is being assaulted may not remember important aspects of the assault, but for example, they might remember what the ceiling tiles in the room looked like because they detached from what was happening to them during the event and they were focusing on something else in the room at the time. So this is a person has a bit of a different way or difficulties remembering what actually happened because they dissociated at the time of the event. These traumatic events can lead to changes in terms of how a person thinks about themselves, the world, other people. So a person may tend to view themselves as bad or damaged, or that there's something inherently broken about them following the traumatic event. They may change how they think about other people. So thoughts like other people aren't trustworthy, or that other people are just evil and are out to harm others. They can see the world as a kind of a more dangerous or threatening place. A person can also experience negative thoughts about the event itself. So negative thoughts about their role in the event. So it's not uncommon for people to experience high levels of guilt or self-blame for what happened, even if they had nothing to do with it or they couldn't have controlled what happened. They can also blame other people inappropriately or unnecessarily. So it can really have distorted views of the cause of the event and who was responsible for it and who was to blame for it. People will sometimes experience persisting negative emotional states, so they frequently experience negative emotional states like fear, horror, anger, guilt, shame. So a person has these types of feelings for much of the time. And the emotions can be quite intense and quite distressing as they're ongoing, and a person can't seem to shake these emotional states. A person can sometimes experience what we call a sense of detachment or estrangement from other people, almost like it's difficult to connect with others, like other people can't relate to me or I can't relate to them. It's almost like the traumatic event has changed me so that I can no longer sort of connect with or relate to other people. This can have a really negative consequence, a really negative impact on relationships as partners or loved ones feel a sense of detachment from the person because it's almost like the person isn't letting them in or isn't sort of emotionally opening up to them anymore. And that can lead to big problems in relationships. A person can also experience a sense of emotional numbing, a difficulty experiencing any positive emotional states like love or happiness. They just feel emotionally flat or numb. They can be in situations where they know they're supposed to feel happy, they're supposed to be joyful or enthusiastic, but they just don't feel anything. There's just kind of an emptiness or a numbness inside. And the last of these types of symptoms is a sense of disconnect or lack of enjoyment or pleasure in activities that a person used to enjoy doing. So they may stop engaging in hobbies or recreational activities or social activities that they used to do because they just don't get any sense of enjoyment, pleasure, or reward from those activities. So these symptoms are all the various different ways in which a person's emotional states, moods, and thoughts can be altered following a traumatic event. Now, the fourth and final cluster of PTSD symptoms relates to something we call hyperarousal symptoms. Essentially, a person is kind of on guard and hyper alert following a traumatic event. So this can take the form of hyperawareness to your environment. So it's not uncommon for people with PTSD to constantly scan their environment. Anytime they're outside of where they feel safe, usually their home, they're constantly scanning to see who's around them and where potential sources of danger or threat may come from. If they're going into a restaurant, they're paying attention to who's coming into that restaurant, where people are. I often see people with PTSD will sit with their back to the wall so they can be aware of any threat or danger in front of them and that they can ensure that nothing's coming from behind them. These symptoms can also include a general sense of increased risk-taking, engaging in sort of reckless behaviors, risk-taking behaviors, or behaviors that are causing a person harm. So sometimes in PTSD you can see people engaging in self-harming behaviors like cutting or burning. They can also engage in behaviors that they know are harmful to them, like excessive alcohol consumption or excessive drug use. But they do it because it's almost like they just have a sense of not caring anymore, or it feels like things don't matter anymore. These hyperarousal symptoms can also take the form of an exaggerated startle response. So a person is easily jumpy or startled by noises or surprises. People with PTSD typically hate surprise parties. I once had a client who went home one day and his family was throwing him a surprise party, and he came in the house and everyone sort of jumped out surprised, and it terrified him, and he just like took off and left the house and was in his car absolutely terrified, shaking, in tears because he had been so startled by this surprise. This hyperarousal can also take the form of difficulty sleeping. So problems falling asleep, problems staying asleep, waking up much earlier in the morning than a person would like to. So it can lead to significant problems with falling or staying asleep. It can lead to high levels of irritability and anger. If a person's constantly on guard, constantly on edge, their fuse gets a lot shorter, and it becomes a lot easier for them to lash out or be really angry or upset at even seemingly small things. This is another symptom of PTSD that can contribute to interpersonal difficulties or problems in relationships, because a person is just so on edge and so irritable and angry that it leads to problems in their relationships. It can also take the form of difficulties with concentration and focus. So no matter how much I try to focus on something, my mind wanders. It's difficult for me to keep my attention on a particular task. And this is in part due to the fact that I'm constantly kind of in this hyper alert state and this hyper aware state. So I'm noticing things around me. So going back to that hypervigilance to the environment, if I'm constantly having to be aware of what's going on around me, it's really difficult for me to focus on this task right in front of me. So those are the four clusters of symptoms that people will experience in PTSD. So re-experiencing symptoms, avoidance symptoms, negative alterations in thoughts and mood, and hyperarousal symptoms. Now, for a diagnosis of PTSD, what's required is at least 1 of 5 re-experiencing symptoms. You need 1 of 2 avoidance symptoms. You need 2 of 7 negative alterations in thoughts and mood symptoms, and you need 2 of 6 hyperarousal symptoms. So if you think about this, what that can mean is that 2 people with PTSD, their PTSD can look very different from one another. In fact, if you just think about the number of symptoms required across these 4 different symptom clusters, you can have over 100 different variants of PTSD. 100 different ways in which people can have a diagnosis of PTSD, but just the way their symptoms line up, they can look very different from one another. And so I think that's part of the reason why people have difficulty really understanding what PTSD is and what it looks like, is because it can look very different in different people just by the nature of the different symptom clusters and the different symptoms within each of those symptom clusters. Now, you might be wondering, who can get PTSD? Is it just combat veterans and people who have been in war zones? The answer is no. PTSD can stem from a variety of different types of traumatic exposures. So obviously the most common one that people will think about is combat veterans. But PTSD can result from accidents. Motor vehicle accidents are the number 1 source or cause of PTSD in North America. It can also involve workplace accidents or things like assault, physical assault, sexual assault, domestic violence. It can involve exposure to natural disasters or certain medical procedures that a person experiences that can be extremely traumatic. So there can be a variety of different types of traumas that can trigger PTSD in people. Now, that can be exposure to those types of traumas, so direct exposure for the person, but it can also result from people witnessing those types of traumatic experiences in others, hearing about those types of traumatic experiences in loved ones or people they care about, or being exposed to those types of traumatic experiences and incidents as part of an individual's job. So for police officers, firefighters, paramedics, who are constantly exposed to seeing these types of traumatic events as part of the nature of their job. And so there can be a wide variety of types of situations and traumatic events that can contribute to PTSD, and a lot of different ways that people can experience these traumatic events. Now, in general, interpersonal violence tends to lead to PTSD more often than, say, accidental exposure to trauma. So things like domestic violence or sexual assault tend to have higher rates of PTSD associated with them than things like workplace accidents or natural disasters. And part of that has to do with the various different components and the different layers that get added on when the trauma involves someone intentionally doing something to harm another person. It sort of changes the way people tend to think about other people, which tends not to be the case with, say, a natural disaster where it just happened and no one was at fault or was responsible for it. So I hope that's been helpful in terms of giving you a better understanding of what PTSD is, what it looks like, and how it might arise. I would love to hear your thoughts and ideas about this, so please leave me some comments in the comments section down below. If you're enjoying my videos and would like to see more of my videos, please hit that subscribe button and that notification bell, and you'll be alerted every Thursday when I post a new video. Thank you for making it all the way to the end of this video, and I will see you in the next one.